Hey everybody, today I'd like to show you how I built this really cool sit-stand desk with this super clean epoxy over oak desktop. There's also a built-in laptop cooling fan and integrated LEDs. Now let's get started on modern builds. I'm making this desktop out of solid red oak that I picked up from Home Depot. Now this is definitely not the most affordable lumber, but it is nice that it comes all four sides straight and square. The final length of my top is going to be about 54 inches, and these are cut just a little bit oversized. I used my circular saw and my 12-inch speed square to make sure I got good, clean, square cuts. The width of my top is about 25.5 inches wide. It uses 4 1x6s and 1 1x4. I used quite a bit of glue when I clamped this panel up, and I did not use any reinforcement like dowels, biscuits, or pocket screws. This whole top is going to get covered with epoxy, and that is going to keep everything locked in together. I did use a wet rag to clean up any glue before it had a chance to dry. That way it made the sanding process easier. I used 80 grit on my random orbit just to flatten and smooth everything out before we moved on to the next step. I want to make sure I've got a really clean face before I pour my epoxy. Before we get to that though, I need to trim the tabletop square. I have a finish blade on my circular saw, but I also put painter's tape down to prevent tear out. Red oak in particular is prone because it's got a fibery grain, but this works with any species of wood. To create the curve that I want to cut out in the front of the desk, I clamped up a straight edge ruler that I had bent along a line centered on the tabletop. I scribed it with my pencil and then used my jigsaw to freehand cut it. Now this gave me an 80% smooth, perfect cut. And to finish it all off, I used 80 grit sandpaper on my random orbit sander to get a really consistent arc and remove any burn marks or imperfections. And here, I'm creating an opening in the wood where we're gonna be installing LEDs along the back of the desktop. This is hopefully gonna shine up through the epoxy, and that'll diffuse the light and make it really nice. I'm sort of imagining a futuristic, space-age, illuminating desktop. I was safe to make sure that I plunge cut into the wood safely with my circular saw. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can always use a jigsaw for the entire cut. This opening is about 1/4 inch bigger than the groove that we're eventually going to route into the desktop. That way we only see the epoxy from the outside. You'll see what I mean. I also cut these 2 outlet ports. This is where I want to feed all of my cords, wires. That way I can organize them into the power trough that's going to be underneath the tabletop. I put one centered on either side of where my computer is going to be. This epoxy mold is going to be really basic. It's just simple strips of whiteboard material that you can pick up from Home Depot. It's about 1/8 inch of MDF with whiteboard on the other side. It cuts really easily, and I'm just using tape to connect it all together around the edges. I was careful to apply it really flat on the whiteboard material and the oak. That way it would prevent leaks. I didn't want there to be a lot of folds in the tape. I also taped the undersides of the opening in the top. And the last thing I did before this mold was complete was cut and glue some styrofoam insulation together to create a negative space in our pour where the fan cooling unit will eventually be. This isn't super necessary, but it will save a lot of work and epoxy. Oh, and I'm just holding this down with double-sided carpet tape. And now we are ready for our epoxy pour. Woo! Instead of using a name brand epoxy like Total Boat or Ecopoxy or any of the others out there, I'm going no name. I got this off of eBay because it shipped quick. And I just want to try and see if it's any good. I have to imagine epoxy is epoxy, so it can't be that much different, right? The directions say that you can pour up to 3 centimeters, which, hey Siri, how thick is 3 centimeters in inches? Is 1.18 inches, which is more than we need. So I'm gonna start by taking a 1/2 gallon of our epoxy and our hardener to create our first 1 gallon pour. Be sure to stir this really well. I set a 3-minute timer, and I made sure to scrape the sides of my container. And a drill attachment like this definitely helps. Once it was stirred, I added a couple drops of this white pigment by Mixol, which is super strong. I don't want this to be a pure white table. I want it to be half translucent. That way you can still see the wood grain underneath, but still white enough to diffuse the LED lights that we integrate later. And I don't want any comments about what this may or may not look like. Deal? Okay, here we go. 3, 2, 1. Oh, that color is great. I thought that was gonna get us way further than it did. My calculations were far from correct. It is pretty thick. Yeah. I didn't think about that. Okay. Oh, okay. Things are looking better. The epoxy wasn't as liquid as I thought it would be, but it did self-level really well. All right, we're speed running this next mix. I'm doing the rest of each gallon. We're moving fast. Thick resin, thicker than I was expecting. So, you may be wondering, what are the chances of this being a success? I'm gonna guess 69%. And just like before, I added pigment and stirred for a couple minutes. We've got about 10 more seconds left. Before I pour, check out how cool it is, how you can see just a little bit of the wood grain underneath the epoxy. Ah, I see what the problem is. No wonder! I was wondering why this side, I was wondering why it was pulling on that side when our table was perfectly level. That's hilarious. And no epoxy on my phone. Win. That's super pro. Pour number 2 was half success, half failure. You'll see the whole thing play out, and I did add a touch more pigment than I initially planned, but I still really like the color. After I spread everything out, I let it set for a few minutes to self-level. Yeah, that's pretty cool. It's got just a little bit of swirling to it. We'll see what the color looks like when it's dry. And this is where I made my big mistake. I was using my torch to pop air bubbles when I got it way too close, and you can see me burning the epoxy for a while before I realized it. I was able to salvage everything by stirring that discolored brown epoxy into the rest of the white, and you don't see it in the finished piece. It didn't self-level 100% perfect, but still really good. And while this epoxy cures overnight, I want to give a big thanks to the sponsor of today's episode, Squarespace. If you need a website, an online store, or just a custom domain, Squarespace is your one-stop shop. And the best part is you need zero website building experience. Squarespace's designer templates look great on desktop, tablet, and mobile no matter where customers find you, and they are packed with tons of great features, like no limits to the number of products that you can sell using a Squarespace store, Squarespace's Video Studio mobile app that allows you to create high-level, professional content for your website and social media, and do not forget member areas where you can package premium content behind a paywall, charging your members a monthly subscription fee. To learn more, make sure and follow my link down in the description. That is squarespace.com/modernbuilds, where you can build out your entire Squarespace site before entering any of your credit card info. And then when it's time to make your website live, don't forget to use my code ModernBuilds for 10% off your first site, store, or domain through Squarespace. One more big thanks to Squarespace. Now let's get this epoxy out of the mold. There ended up being zero chance of getting this whiteboard material away from where it got stuck to the epoxy, so I broke off as much as I could and removed all of the tape from the bottom. I used my sander to clean up a little bit of the epoxy that bubbled around my packing tape, and then I used a straight edge and my circular saw around all of the edges of the tabletop to cut it free. I did this in a few passes, that way I didn't burn the oak as badly. And for the curve, I came back the same way I did before with my jigsaw and random orbit sander to make sure I got a nice arch. I know a ton of people aren't as confident with a jigsaw as me. Just try your best to go slowly and to look over the jigsaw down at your line. That really helps a lot. Oh no! Hopefully that's gonna be able to sand back. Okay, I should have switched blades after it started getting hot. Live and learn. Be sure to wear a respirator anytime you sand, but especially epoxy, because that's just plastic dust. Gross. But I was able to sand the burnout, and then I removed the insulation that I put on the inside of the mold to create the negative for the fan that we'll be putting in there in just a little bit. Then I added 80 grit sandpaper onto my random orbit, and without a lot of downward pressure, I tried to work methodically across this entire tabletop to flatten everything out and to reveal any air bubbles that I had left. Now, unfortunately, I had more air bubbles than I wanted because I didn't use the torch after I made that huge mess burning the epoxy. So I came back and I actually did a flood coat to fill all of the voids that I had left over. I didn't want to build a thick layer of epoxy, I just wanted a thin layer to cover the whole desktop and fill any of the voids that I did have left. Now this worked really well. It didn't self-level perfectly, so I did have quite a bit of sanding to do the next day after everything was able to cure overnight, but I'm happy to report I now have a flat, smooth desktop, and the pigment matches pretty well, so the bubbles don't really stand out too bad. The first thing on our router task list is to cut a groove on the bottom of our desktop where the LEDs are going to eventually install. Now we're using a 3/4 inch bit, and this is a 1 inch opening that we cut into the oak, so there should be an 1/8 inch of epoxy on either side of our groove if it's centered. I made the groove a 1/2 inch deep, but I did it in multiple passes. That way I didn't put too much strain on the router, and I used a straight edge, of course. I used the same setup to create the cable pass-throughs that are gonna feed to our power trough, but these go all the way through the tabletop.
All right, you can see my hand underneath. I think we're gonna make it through on the next pass.
I had to bottom out this bit to get all the way through the desk, but I'm happy that I was able to. Thumbs up. Today's project is steaming right along, and our next step is to install this fan cooling unit into our desktop. I picked this up on Amazon, and I'll leave a link in the description along with everything else I used. And this whole unit is the same thickness as our oak and the epoxy combined. So I'll use my jigsaw to cut through both layers, and you can see me using masking tape to prevent tear out. After I had the outline traced, I drilled quite a few holes in strategic locations. That way I could approach these cuts coming in straight rather than at a curve, which is more likely to cause a jigsaw blade to deflect. Just like before, I took my time and I really made sure to try and stay right on that line. Ultimately, I'm gonna smooth everything out with my sander, so I just wanted to make sure that I didn't have any big negative spaces that I'm gonna have to sand back to. And once that was done, I could remove the panel and test fit my fan unit.
Perfect!
Then I came back with my random orbit sander to clean up everything that I could reach, and that got all of my lines really straight, and I used a flat file anywhere that was too tight to reach with the sander. This laptop fan does need a USB cable to get to it, that way it can power on, and here you can see the groove that I drew out and I cut with my router, that way I could feed it into that opening. And in hindsight, I had no reason to route past the pass-through for the power cables, so don't do that. But here you can see how the fan sets in there and the cable can feed to it. These oak boards that I'm gluing up are going to create the new bottom for our fan unit. Like I mentioned, it's the same thickness as the oak desktop and the epoxy put together, so we need a new false bottom for it. I cut a 45-degree angle on the front-facing edge, and then I just glued it in place. I didn't want to use any fasteners, and this ended up working fine. In total, the laptop cooling unit has 6 fans, and I used hole saws in corresponding locations and sizes to make sure that they could vent. The fans suck cool air up from the bottom of the desktop and blow it up to the laptop to cool it down. Oh, and technically, I used a Forstner bit for the smaller holes here. Either way, just make sure you use painter's tape to prevent tear out, like I did. Super Pro! Cable management is very important whenever you're making a sit-stand desk. Otherwise, you're just gonna have a mess of cables lifting and lowering off of the ground whenever you adjust the table. The power trough I'm making has pocket screws on one side, and that's what I'll use to connect it to the desktop. But right here, I just used wood glue and clamps to put this whole channel together. While that glue was drying, I attached some 1x3s onto the bottom of my desktop. That way there would be a flat plane across the whole bottom where it secures to the base. Now that I added that false bottom for the fan, I needed to add these strips where the cross members of our base go. And then I used pocket screws to connect our power trough. And quick pro tip, Craig Jig sells different species plugs for whatever species you're building your project out of. They just don't really carry them at Home Depot or Lowe's. Check online, I'll leave a link below. This hole that I'm drilling on the bottom of our power trough right in the center is where our power cable is gonna feed through, and every bit of excess will store inside of the trough. So now we're getting really close to done with this desktop. I used my sander with 220 grit to make sure everything on the epoxy was really nice. I also used a 400 grit sanding sponge to polish away any scuff marks I could find. Then I did the same with 220 grit on the bottom to the oak. And you know I'm gonna be using Maker Brand Simple Finish on this oak. It's gonna really bring out the color and the depth in the grain and contrast nicely with the stark white top. Just make sure and apply a heavy coat, that way it can soak into the wood, and then give it 15 minutes before you wipe away the excess. Oh yeah, and the final thing I did before I brought all of this inside to connect it to the base is cut this thin strip of oak that I'll be attaching the LED light strip to. I used my sander to round the end, that way it matches the groove that we cut out, and then I attached the LEDs onto the strip. This wood is 3/4 inch wide, and I made a 3/4 inch groove, so it's actually a perfect friction fit. I was originally planning on using magnets, but I hate magnets, and I'm glad I don't need to. This base is from a company called FlexiSpot, and fair warning, they did send it to me for free for this project. Either way, I was really excited to receive it because it is a heavy-duty sit-stand base that is really easy to install. You just need to connect the legs to the rest of the base, and then the base to the tabletop. Each of these legs have an individual motor and self-leveling feet, which are really wide. I'll be sure to leave a promotional link down in the description if you're interested in checking them out, and you can see here how it's adjustable width.
And that would be a huge desk.
After I made sure everything was centered and lined up, I pre-drilled holes everywhere that I was gonna install a screw, that way I would prevent the wood from splitting. I just used the screws that came with the kit, and they were about 3/4 of an inch long. Next, I plugged in each leg to the power unit, then the controller to the same. I attached this to the bottom of the desk with a couple of screws, and this is what you use to raise and lower it. And on the fly, I did need to drill this opening for the power cable to feed through the power trough and into the base. Then I covered everything up with the cover that it comes with. And finally, I reinstalled the LEDs on the bottom of the desk, then I flipped everything over and started plugging things into my power strip. The cable feeds through the bottom of the trough and into the plug. It'll have just enough slack to raise up and down, but no extra, which is a really clean look.
Oh, it works!
After that, I could finally reinstall my fan unit and power it up. Oh, and check out the LEDs on the border. How cool is that? And any power cables I need can go through that pass-through. The base that I used, link in the description, can program your favorite sit and standing height. Mine is 28 inches when I'm sitting and 43 inches when I'm standing. And with that, this project is done. This sit-stand desk had a whole lot of steps to it, but it came out looking really cool. This absolutely looks like it came right out of a store, and the integrated power and LEDs couldn't be cooler. The white desktop and the white base pair nicely, but the oak offsets it and contrasts really well. So I really hope y'all enjoyed today's project. If you did, make sure and click like and comment down below, and we'll see you next time on Modern Builds. Bye, everybody.